Sundar really has so much depth around IAM, around security, as well as development. I really come across these kind of professionals where they have so much unique qualities. And again, one of the main reason why Sundar was able to learn all of this is the hunger of technology, hunger of knowing things. He did not restrict himself to just knowledge of IAM or just knowledge of security. He had developer knowledge. He added security into that. He added IAM into that, and now he's working as a product security engineer. And in this entire podcast, you'll hear interesting conversation about how someone can aspire for that role, what he has done throughout his journey in terms of acquiring these skills. I guarantee you'll enjoy the entire episode. This is the part one of the episode. We'll have part two coming in this Friday. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode.
Welcome to India's first identity podcast. Why not IAM?
Hey, hi Sundar, how are you? Good
I'm doing
afternoon.
good, Ravi. Thanks for having me in.
Hope you're doing good. And thank you very much again for joining us in the new episode of the podcast series where we are trying to bring in guests from different product companies and we are trying to talk about their journey so that it inspires the coming generation of the new IAM experts, analysts, and professionals out there here in India.
Yeah,
Thank you very much for joining us.
yeah, it's my pleasure.
Without any further delay, I just want to straightly jump into the question of how does it feel to be working in Ping Identity? It was one of my dream company 5 years ago where I was working as an engineer. So can you share your experience with all the viewers? How does it feel to be working there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, Ping Identity, as many might already know, is one of the most famous identity and access management company. Like we started back in most probably 2006. I don't remember the year when we were established, but since then, Ping Identity has constantly been a leader in the IAM space, and amongst others, of course. But we have very robust identity and access management products and the suites, and we reach to some of the corners of the customer use cases that other companies might not be able to reach. So, in that sense, Ping Identity's solution suite is very robust, very elegant, and it feels absolutely amazing from product perspective, and working here is also a pleasure, right? My experience of working in Ping Identity is mostly based out of the Bangalore office because I haven't been to the other parts of the other offices that Ping Identity has.
Mhm.
But talking about the Bangalore office, it is awesome. The culture is awesome. The location is awesome. It's right
Okay.
at the center of the city, and amongst a lot of other companies, you get to meet a lot of very talented people. We have representations of the SRE, the SQE, the development, the cloud engineering, and then of course the security, to where I belong. So all of these teams together make the good software deliver from here.
Okay. Great to know about this. Now, going back a little bit towards your journey, right? I know Ping is your third company, and you have also spent a couple of years or more than that in various different companies. So, how did IM happen to you, right? What made you jump into IM, or was this a conscious decision that you landed in your first job as IM and you moved from there? So, can you walk us through your journey? Where did it all started?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a bit of a interesting background history. I started as a big data developer. I was developing ETL pipelines, MapReduce jobs, Spark jobs for Comcast. And I was very interested in this subject called distributed computing, where you design highly scalable distributed systems that get deployed on the cloud and processes immense amount of data either in real time or in batch. This is what I used to do. This is what my research was on back in the college days, and this is what I wrote my thesis on. Everything was related to distributed computing. Now, while I was
Hmm.
working as a big data engineer, this company called EQ Technology pulled me in and they offered me a job in the IAM space. I wasn't aware that it was in the IAM space, but they needed
Hmm.
data engineering in the IAM space, right? They were developing Ping Federate equivalent or a federation service
Hmm.
for Siemens products. So they had these business intelligence and migration and integration product called EQBI and EQBMI.
Medical devices, right? I think Siemens is more into medical.
Yeah, but we're talking about Siemens PLM, the product
Okay,
lifecycle
okay,
products, right?
okay.
And we used to develop IAM products for them. Now they needed somebody with the big data or distributed computing experience because that is that was a requirement of their federation service. They wanted to scale the federation service. So the knowledge that was required for that was core Java and distributed computing, which I had, and it was like a luck that I got into there. It was like a luck that they needed somebody with big data experience. So that's how I started my IAM journey. We were developing federation services and pretty much all the IAM services that used to log users into Siemens PLM software using SSO.
Mm-hmm.
And along with that, we took care of all the security requirements of EQ Technologic as well. So we were called the security team in there. But it was not exactly a product security role. Like
Okay,
product security is very different. But yeah, I was very deeply integrated into the IAM space. That's where I got introduced into the IAM. And I was a pure developer back then, but in the IAM space, right? So it's like a security software developer kind of a role.
okay.
Uh, and that's where I started looking into roles that are more security oriented. Like I have both the security experience and the developer experience. I started ramping myself up for the security as well because when you're talking about security, that's a lot of things. You have to
Mm-hmm.
do code review, penetration testing, design reviews, architecture reviews, threat modeling, researching on the CVEs, researching on the source code of the third-party libraries that you pull in. So all of these are various different things that needs to be done as a product security engineer besides development. So with
Mm-hmm.
only the development experience, I couldn't get into a product security role, right? So I started looking into these roles. I started ramping myself up, upskilling myself before I found an opening for product security engineers from the Ping Identity careers page. So that's where I went and I applied and I got an opportunity to work in Ping as a product security engineer. And I've never been happier.
Okay. So one thing that I'm actually curious here is when you said that you're more from a development background, right?
Yeah.
And then you are looking to ramp up and upskill yourself in IAM, and then again learn about security, right? So can you help us with that experience or that journey? Because getting and clearing interview in Ping will require you to definitely have some good IAM knowledge. Not basic won't be enough.
Yeah.
So how was that journey? Because that is something that is making me curious. Because again, if I talk about resources, there is very less resources, and training wise, very less training. There is no community as such. So can you walk us through that journey? Like from the time you decided you want to learn about IAM, what were the key areas that you invested?
Yeah, that question makes sense to me. When I was into IAM, it was from the practical experience that I learned about all these different protocols and the designs and the architectures that the IAM Federation servers follow. So
Mm-hmm.
there are two parts to the question, as I believe. Firstly, I'm going to address how do you ramp up and learn about IAM, right? That domain in itself is a beast. And then I'm going to
Yes.
talk about security in general. And then I'm going to talk
Mm-hmm.
about security of the IAM, which is a specialization. So coming to the IAM part, I believe IAM is, yeah, you are right about the fact that it's not very well documented. Not many companies do have a lot of documentation in understanding how
Mm-hmm.
IAM works. And when we talk about IAM, we are talking about absolutely thousand different things, right?
Yes.
So for somebody trying to get into the IAM space, I would say it starts with the protocols, right? What we want to do, we want to log somebody in, we want to authenticate, and we want to authorize while keeping an audit. So this is called a AAA, authentication,
Mm-hmm.
authorization, and auditing, AAA paradigm.
Yes.
When we talk about authentication and authorization, there are multiple different protocols that can handle that, right? For authentication, I can talk about, for example, OpenID Connect or SAML authentication or Kerberos authentication or
Yeah.
NTLM authentication, authenticating using LDAP bind. So there are so many different kinds of protocols that can take place, that can happen before a person is logged into an application. So all these different protocols are essentially leading to one outcome, and that is we verify the identity of whatever resource or user is trying to log into our system. It's all about the verification. Like once the
Mm-hmm.
verification happens, then we try to understand what does this particular resource or user have access to, and what if, even if it has an access to a particular thing, or a resource inside of our system, what are all the actions that it is allowed to perform? So that brings us to the authorization. And in authorization, again, we got a bunch of different types of techniques and methodologies that we can adopt for performing authorization. But I think the role-based access control or attribute-based access control are the things that are the top-notch and are the best in the market, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
My guide for understanding IAM very deeply would be to go and learn about AWS IAM. Amazon Web Services has pioneered this inside of their cloud. If you go and learn about the AWS IAM, and they have a very extensive document of how they manage the IAM over there. But a person who is trying to learn IAM would get a very solid idea about how IAM works, how in general authorization and authentication works from the AWS IAM document. So that is the first place to go and look at. And I think it's a very good resource.
Okay. Great. Mhm.
Yeah. And for security, talking about security, I think the Bible for security would be OWASP, like owsp.org.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I think OWASP has everything. If you're looking for some basic penetration testing guideline, they have a guideline for that. They have a
Mhm.
top 10 for what you should look into inside of a web application. So OWASP top 10. They have what are the top 10 vulnerabilities that appear inside of the APIs. So OWASP API top 10.
Top 10. Yeah.
They have OWASP low code, no code top 10. What are the top 10 vulnerabilities in a low code, no code application? Right. So they have guidelines for everything. They have a penetration testing guideline. They have a manual testing guideline. They have SAST, DAST. They have all sorts of different manuals and tutorials that a person can use to learn about application penetration testing and security in general. So I think OWASP is a very good resource. So if you're looking for breaking into the IAM plus security space, these are the first two resources, like learning about AWS
Mhm.
and AWS IAM, especially because you want to understand authentication and authorization, and then learning about the all the things that OWASP provides. Threat modeling. OWASP also provides guidelines for threat modeling, even software for threat modeling, got Threat Dragon, right? These two resources are going to be immensely helpful if you're going to be a security software engineer.
Okay. Okay. That is immense knowledge. I am pretty much sure a lot of our viewers are going to check out these two resources. The first one is the AWS IAM resource that is out there. The second one, if they want to build knowledge around security, it will be all the OWASP's article, which includes top 10 of web development, API security, and other low code, no code solutions, and all of this. And these are mainly keeping in mind the threats, right? If they talk about the top 10, these are top 10 best practices that you can follow if you are building a solution, keeping in mind the security, right?
Yeah,
That is, these are the recommendation. And you did mention about threat modeling. This is something that I have also been trying to inculcate in my organization, and I find it very valuable. Especially the Microsoft has one recommendation, right, where they talk about the stride principle.
yeah,
So that has also helped me a lot. And absolutely, I think for any IM professional, IM is now not just about the tool, the technology. It's more about how you safeguard and how you have a mindset of a security practitioner, followed by the IM. I would say a layer on top of it, right? I mean, then only you become a perfect IM professional. I mean, and then you can work in any of the roles. I think that should be fine. But again, thank you very much, Sundar, for sharing all these insights. These are very helpful.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
moving on to the next question, how does the process look like? Okay, before that, how did you find the job? Like, were you applying in Naukri or LinkedIn? Like, how did you came across this particular role? That is one question. Second question is, how did you even find that this is the relevant role for you? Because if it is just usually people do search for I am engineer, I am operations, I am architect, I am something written as I am, but this is product security engineer. There's no I am written on it. So how did you figure out that this role is perfect for you?
Makes sense. First of all, for finding the job, since I was in the IM space, I was looking for some role related to security because I was already in a security team. But then at the same time, as I mentioned, I was ramping myself up for more traditional type of security. This was like a hardcore development role. And then I also had some security experiences. So
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to find like the right amalgam of development and security. So I researched a little bit online. And I understood that the product security is like the perfect role for it. So that's what I got to know about it, right? Product security is where you apply security, application security, traditional security, network penetration testing, and all that stuff, along with development. You need a lot of development experience in order to work in this role as well.
Okay.
And yeah, solid development experience, not just a touch base of development, right? You have to be a developer before you become a product security engineer. And since I was in the IAM space already, I was well versed with all the IAM companies and who is doing good in the market. I also went to the Okta Careers page. I also went to Ping Identity, ForgeRock, Salesforce, and all that. There's the other company called SailPoint. They're also doing very good. So all these companies, I went to their careers page and I started applying for the product security role. And the job description of the product security role in Ping Identity was probably the best suited one for me because it was like a 60% security and a 40% development sort of a role.
So that is how you did determine about this particular role by going into the career pages of various product companies
Yeah.
and then finding the right fit for you, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
then did you apply it on the company portal itself, or was it through LinkedIn or
Yeah.
any other?
For me, it was a direct application from the careers page of Ping Identity.
Okay, 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 great, great. Now, another question that just popped up in my mind while you were talking about languages, right? The development languages. What? Because this is more for developers who already know development. I know a lot of our community members who are really good developers and they are also into IEM. So I think this question might be helpful for them. Is like, what are some of the languages that you should be knowing, coding languages, if you want to start a career in product as a product security engineer? You mentioned that they should be a developer first, right? So can you name few coding languages that they should know?
I wouldn't want to name any coding languages
Hmm.
because the whole IAM, the domain itself, as it is designed, is very language agnostic. It doesn't need you to know a particular language. For
Okay.
example, I was a core Java developer, right? So when I
Hmm.
was developing the IAM system, I was developing it in Java. But and here in itself at Ping, all the systems are mostly developed in Java, except few orchestration systems are made in Node.js, right?
Yeah.
I think the choice of a language is not the driving factor, right? If you want to build something, it's about the requirement of the software. It's about the performance requirements, the DevOps requirements, what you want to build, how you want to integrate, all of those things, right? A lot of different, and also your architecture. Most importantly, your architecture probably because where you want to deploy it. Do you want to
Yes.
deploy it on-prem, or do you want to have it in a SaaS environment, in a controlled environment of your own, right? All of those things determine the choice of technology. So I wouldn't say that a language is important, but more importantly, the concepts of IAM, right? How do you do OpenID Connect, relying party, and how do you develop an authorization service? In any language, it can be in Python, it can be in Java, it can be in Golang, it can be in Node.js, right? But how
Okay.
do you develop either of these? So that's a knowledge that is going to be helpful more than the knowledge of the language itself, in my opinion.
Okay. No, that is a very good approach because again, it makes people comfortable because few people might be having a notion that you should know only Java or you should only Python, but you have actually opened up a space saying there is no limitation of what tool you should be knowing or what development language you should be having. Even knowing one and then trying to delve into other should be the right mindset,
Yeah.
right?
And
Okay.
also, I would like to mention another fact. Since I was in the Java development space,
Mhm.
in Java, we talk about application security or IAM in either of these. Java provides frameworks for everything, right? If we're
Mhm.
talking about Java, 90% of the time we're talking about Spring Framework, right? So everything is being developed on Spring Framework. It's the go to library for every Java development and something like that. There's also another one called Vertex, which there are many, but Vertex is one other thing that I'm a big fan of. I'm going to talk about Vertex in a bit.
Mhm.
But when we are talking about any particular framework, it's more than the language that the framework provides you some security specific feature. Like in Spring, you got a module called Spring Security, right? That allows you to make an application that can easily talk to OpenID providers, that can easily talk to SAML providers, or it can help you in Kerberos authentication. If you are deeply integrated into one particular technology space, let's say you come from the Java world or you come from the Node.js world, I would highly suggest that you go and learn the most standard framework and their security modules or the security offerings that a particular framework has a little bit in depth, so that those frameworks, learning those frameworks teaches a lot about the best practices, what's the community following, and also talks about how the other frameworks in other technologies work, because they would be very similar in their functionalities.
Okay.
So that's one way to approach it as well.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Sundar. Now, getting into another question is when you talk about development knowledge, right? And for example, if I'm a fresher working, or I mean, I'm a fresher where I'm studying in a computer science, doing a computer science course, right? And if I want to get into IAM, or if I am a developer, 2 3 years experience, and I want to get into IAM and work into development, what level of development knowledge that person should have? I mean, what that person should have done? Should they have built an app? Should they have worked in a product company? Should they have done some customization? What is that few things that you would recommend people, like, guys, do these things that will make sure that it'll make your life easier when you're trying to look for a job as a product security engineer? Can you name few tasks, few projects that they can do?
Yeah, I cannot name a few projects, but I can talk about a few functional areas that a
Function,
developer
yes, yeah.
would work. Yeah. So for the functional areas part, I would say you first of all should know about a strongly consistent database. Now it could be a SQL database or a NoSQL database, but it has to be a strongly consistent one. And the reason being, so SQL databases are highly consistent, right? If you've got multiple nodes inside of a cluster, SQL databases make sure that a data written into one cluster or one node inside of a cluster is always available in the other nodes inside of the cluster as well. And that is called a strong consistency, right? And there's also a theorem called a CAP theorem: consistency, availability, and partition. These three, partition tolerance, these three things cannot be achieved at the same time. Databases are built based on one of the or two of these three things, right? So SQL databases are, for example, all about consistency and partition tolerance. They might not be available all the time. And there can be changes as well. For in the NoSQL world, MongoDB is a strongly consistent database, right? So a person who is getting into the IAM world should know about the databases, because
Okay.
the reason being, let's say you change a password on one of the nodes, right? You change a password and that data gets written in one of the nodes inside of a database in a cluster. But that data doesn't get synced before you try to log in again, like almost immediately. So now the query for logging you in goes to a different node inside of the cluster where the data has not been synced yet, and you can still log in using your old password. And that is far from ideal. Now, that's one of the big red flags inside of an IAM system. If you have changed your password, you should be able to log out all your sessions and make sure that you changed it is reflected. All your changes that you make inside of your user profile or the identity profile that you have on the system are reflected across all the nodes in a very consistent manner, right? So you want to
Yeah.
be able to design highly consistent systems. Even if you're using a not so consistent database, let's say Cassandra, for example, is a very highly available distributed database, but that's not consistent. So even if you do that, you have to make sure the code that you write in order to access that database must make it consistent, must have a single entry point that makes sure that whatever you've written is also reflected in the other parts. So working
Okay.
with the database, a functional knowledge of how databases work, how distributed systems work, how the data consistency works, and how clustering works in general in a distributed system or in a cloud setup is very important. That's number one. The number two that I want to talk about is how do you audit log? How do you monitor your system? Whenever you're building an IAM system, you can expect millions and millions of logins if your system is pretty big enough or you're deploying a system in a very busy customer environment or something like that. So, how do you make your system scalable enough, right? How do you scale up and down according to the requirement while also because you're scaling up, I'm assuming that you're also making lots of pods or different instances of the same application deployed on different VMs while scaling up. How do you make sure that these nodes form a cluster and talk to each other in a meaningful way while not deteriorating the performance, right? So performance requirements and monitoring the performance requirement, most importantly. Like if one of your node is going down, for example, right? You do not want your users to not be able to log in. So how do you geo replicate your application? because that is literally the front page of your application. That's the first page you hit. Um, yeah, and if that's down, pretty much the entire application is useless at that point. So how do you make it highly available? So yeah, another aspect of distributed computing, right? How do you make it highly available? How do you make it
Availability, yeah.
very resilient? Yes.
Mhm.
And another important thing is the monitoring on who is hitting a particular endpoint on your IAM system. Because you see, the IAM system is the one that is authenticating your identities. And all
Yes.
the requests that comes to your IAM system are expected to be unauthenticated, right? Because the rest of the application can easily rely on the presence of an access token or a cookie or something like that, right? Which would further be verified by the IAM system. And then if it is not verified, you can reject the request. But all the requests that comes to your IAM system itself or the federation server itself are unauthenticated. So you can expect a lot of security issues when you are dealing with unauthenticated requests, right? You have to ensure strong TLS authentication, mutual TLS authentication, or you have to have functional knowledge about how TLS works. Very important. You have to have functional knowledge about what kind of attacks can happen on an unauthenticated endpoint. For example, denial of service attack, right? And how do you avert a denial of service attack? How do you avert a distributed denial of service attack? Because DDoS is traditionally very difficult to deal with. Yeah, if you have so many different clients that the adversary has spun up and it's all hitting a single endpoint, how do you record that? How do you monitor that? How do you get alerted that a DDoS attack is happening? And if it is happening, how do you automatically segregate the bot data that is performing the DDoS, and then how do you segregate the actual data that is trying to log in, like the real users who are trying to log into your system, right? And then when it's segregated, how do you send your real user to a different region where a different backup of your IAM application is running, which would be handling those requests, right? So that your application is always available. So all those things, we have to be able to work on these things, and we have to have functional knowledge of these things. It's not necessary to have the experience, because not all companies face the same kind of a threat surface or attack surface, and therefore the experience is not so important, but you need to have a functional knowledge as a developer to be able to work with all these things. Now, talking about the hardcore development perspective, or let's say how should the day-to-day life of a developer should look like, you should know how to build DALs, like the data access layers, the DAOs, the data access objects, right? And then you should be able to make transformers and migration utility. And by transformer and migration utility, let's say you want to upgrade your IAM system, and your old IAM system was following some kind of a database schema, and the new IAM version, let's say you're upgrading from version 4.9 to 5.0, right? The old data in the database cannot be discarded, even though the old data doesn't fit into the new schema. So that's where you need a transformation and migration system to read the old data and transform it into a new data, which is consistent with the old data, but fits into the new schema, so that the new server that you're deploying immediately starts working as if no changes happened.
Okay.
So yeah, migration and transformation, then distributed computing, distributed services, Kubernetes and cloud computing are absolute must at this moment, because I would say a lot of these IAM systems are on-prem. Like if you are talking about IAM architecture, many of the IAM components are deployed on-prem inside of the customer's environment.
Yeah.
And the reason being, customers do not want their identities to be stored on somebody's SaaS platform, right?
Cloud
Their
platforms.
identities are their assets. So imagine a situation where generally customers use, or any other big company or corporation would use, Active Directory or some sort of a directory server to store their identities. So you need to have a delegate or a kind of software that would do the authentication on your behalf, sitting inside of their system, accessing their AD records. So that is what, for example, Ping Federate does. That is what we used to develop in EQ technology. That is what your on-prem federation server would do. And then when you try to log people in from the SaaS platform, your federation server would be acting as an OpenID authorization service. And your SaaS platform would be working as an OpenID relying party. And then when you try to log into one of your cloud services that is not inside of the private cloud, in this case, let's say ping 1 would reach out to the ping federate that is running inside of the customer's infrastructure, and ping federate would do all the authentication, take the username and password and everything, and then get back to ping 1, say that yeah, this person is authenticated. Ping 1 would trust ping federate, and that's how ping 1 knows that you're now authenticated with ping 1 itself, and then ping 1 would log you in into other applications, right?
Yeah.
But what we achieve in all of this is that you can log in from our ping 1 platform, which is running in our SaaS environment, whilst having all the identities inside of the customer's environment. Those identities are not stored with us, right? So all of these things, how do we achieve communication between a private cloud or a private system and a public cloud, right? What are all the security requirements of such a communication? So all those things have to be taken into consideration, and I think a developer should know all these before jumping into the security of an IAM space.
Absolutely. This is very, I would say, heavy knowledge, right? Important one though. And people might take this as a good, they should be making note of this and should put all of the things that you have just mentioned as a roadmap, which would then eventually prepare them as a roadmap as a product security engineer. Maybe in a span of 6 months to an year should be a good time to spend learning these things, right? Because as much as these things are important, it is also key to ensure that people should be responsibly using all of this knowledge, right? They should not be having like a bare minimum knowledge of security. If they are trying to learn security, they should know the length and breadth. At least like it should be a continuous learning process. It should not be they just know a little bit about everything. So this is a very good roadmap for people who are aspiring to add a security layer in their already in a a space where they already know IAM, right? And also add the development layer, or people who are already a developer, they can add the security and IAM and then try to build their profile as a product security engineer or a IAM security engineer. Because I've seen these security and IAM nowadays, I think it's been a couple of years, are going very much hand in hand. But thank you very much again, Sundar. This was a really a great insight. Now, going back to, so we have discussed about your journey, how did you ended up in Ping, and then what people should be learning about. Now, can you walk us through about your role as a product security engineer at Ping Identity, and how does the typical day look like for you?
Yeah, sure. So at Ping Identity, as a product security engineer, we have to collaborate with the engineering or the development teams, right? I'm just gonna
Hmm.
refer to the developers as engineering team,
Yeah.
and then ours is a security team. So we integrate into the SDLC in order to ensure that it's a secure SDLC or SSDLC. So we indulge into threat modeling, architecture review, design review at the very beginning of the definition of an epic. So when we have a new feature that we need to develop or some kind of an existing feature that we need to improve, we first define what the engineering would ideally define what the requirements are, what the expected changes are, and then we would get involved in those reviews of it and threat modeling of it in order to provide our inputs and order to make them secure. And this is a part of the shift left strategy. So that, and by shift left, push the security changes, requirements, and the reviews as early into the development steps as possible, right? So that you don't have
Okay.
to do too many changes, or you're not expecting too many of huge security requirements coming in later at the development stage when it's already too late, right?
And how do you
Yeah.
ensure that? Sorry, I just wanted to ask that question. When you
Yeah.
said that, definitely one of the best practices is to ensure you're adding security inputs during the initial stage of the SDLC. But
Right.
again, what is the key thing that organization should keep in mind? Because usually I've seen a security review being done once you at least cover the architectural design and then do POC and then come up with a basic version, right? And then the security team would again conduct pen testing, threat modeling, and those kind of things. But when you say add this before in the initial cycle, like what would you consider when you are even talking to the security?
So I think the part of the problem is how do we first of all get indulged, right? Because a lot of times what
Hmm.
happens is engineering does not work with the stakeholders, right? So if let's say if I were a developer, I would have probably done the same. I would have defined the epic myself. I would have laid down a fundamental architecture and then involved the stakeholders. And that's where security needs to establish this diplomatic relationship with the engineering and a high level channel where they can
Mhm.
communicate and set the expectation that security is also a stakeholder in the epic, right? So whenever you are reviewing an epic, a
Mhm.
security needs to get involved as early as possible. And by as early as possible, I mean that they need to get involved the moment a draft of an architecture is laid down, right? When the document gets
Okay.
established. You involve a product security engineer in, and they start reviewing it. And that review has to be done incrementally, right? If I, for example, review it 1 month earlier and then I leave it, I don't go and revisit the document again and again. By that 1 month, a lot of things would have changed. And then the initial assessment of security that we would have done is, anyways, not applicable anymore.
Mm.
This is an incrementally continuous process that we need to always get involved in the design review, in the architecture review, and we need to constantly probably also keep updating the threat model itself, that I know that's pertaining to that particular feature. And then we need to tell the engineering about the threats and the problems that can arise from a particular design choice. And this is also a little bit of a tricky part, because we have to strike the right balance between usability, user experience, developer experience, as well as security, right? Because
Uh-huh.
we are collaborating together to make the business move forward together, and not like, we're not policemen, we're not cops, so we're not
Yes.
there to slow them down. We are there to collaborate with them so that we move together towards the same goal, that is to sell the product ultimately. But while doing so, we also want to ensure the security is intact. So in order to do that, we have to tell them that this is the threat that I see, and also involve them into the brainstorming. So that is a reason why the threat modeling is often encouraged to be done with the architects on the from the engineer side, with the security
Mhm.
champions and some of the developers who are working on the epic itself, right? So you involve everybody and not just the security team. So this is part of the reason why, that should happen.
Okay. Okay.
um, yeah, and pretty much from there, we would provide the secure architecture over to them once it's finalized, once everybody is happy and the architecture diagram is frozen, no further changes happen. Once all the stakeholders are happy, we start developing on it.
Okay. Great. That is what I wanted to understand again personally, as well as for all our viewers, because somewhere, as you said, security folks are definitely considered as policemen, but then I am pretty much sure whenever a security team gets involved, it is more to act as an enabler so that eventually, when your product goes out, you have less worry to think about the product from a threat, from an attack vector perspective, and including them in the initial cycle. Yes, there is a slight, I would say, time that you would consume, that you would need for the security team to review things, but that would eventually make sure that your product is headed in the right direction from a security plus a value adding and user experience perspective, right?
Yes.
Moving on to the next question, can you name three primary responsibilities and objectives of a product security engineer in your organization?
Yes, I think the three primary responsibilities would be threat modeling, number
Hmm.
one. Number two, continuous vulnerability assessment. And
Hmm.
that is a big term, by the way. When I talk about continuous vulnerability assessment, the SAST, DAST, and the third party CVE vulnerability detection and monitoring, and all of those have to be automated as well. And
Hmm.
these three things are beast in itself. Again, they're very big domains. And I'm going to talk about them a bit later. But yeah, continuous vulnerability assessment. And the third, and definitely not the least, is responding to the customer inquiries. Because you see, and
Okay,
compliance and customer inquiries, I would say that, because every company, in order to sell the product, should comply with a certain requirement. If you want to sell your product to some federal government organization, you need FedRAMP certification. If
absolutely.
you want to sell it to health department, or if you want to sell it to some kind of a medical company, you need to comply with the medical requirements, and they have,
Mm,
yeah,
as one of the
HIPAA
compliance.
compliance. And then we have GDPR compliance for the European region. So
Mm, yeah.
each of these compliance requirement needs the ProdSec input. There has to be, they mandate a security process to be there while the software is being developed, so that we can constantly keep on monitoring the guardrails and all the security controls that we have during the development lifecycle itself, right?
Hmm.
And when we talk about the customer inquiries, sometimes the customer can find vulnerabilities in our product, and they can constantly do assess the product because it's running inside of their environment, right? And this is especially relevant for the on-prem products. Customers can come back with their own scans, their own vulnerabilities, their own pen test reports and stuff. And
Mhm.
that becomes an inquiry of a very high priority because it's coming from the customer, right? It has a direct impact on the business if we don't respond to them. So ProdSec engineers are very important in the organization from that perspective. Like you need to respond to the customer security inquiries as early as possible and as soon as possible. Because once a security breach happens, and if it is a big one, there's very little you can do to control the damage. Yeah, it's a tarnishing of the image, it's a damage of the reputation, a lot of things, both from the customer's perspective and from the company provider's perspective, right? Yeah, ProdSec engineers, three top roles would be number one, threat modeling, number two, continuous vulnerability assessment, and number three, compliance and customer inquiries. That is what I would say.
Okay, okay. Thank you, thank you. And going to the another question, right? So Ping Identity is known for its identity and access management solutions, right? From 2002 onwards, since the company got established,
Yeah.
it's more around IAM focus from on-prem to cloud and adding various components around directories, IGA, and the MFA solutions. I know it's a really awesome product. Now, when we talk about ping, we think about IAM, right? Then
Yeah.
how does security play a role in that development and deployment of this product? Can you walk us through that journey?
Yeah, sure. I think the security is not just particularly relevant in the IAM space. It is relevant everywhere, right? If you are developing anything, not just IAM, let's say you're developing a CI/CD pipeline software, if you're developing a ticketing system like Jira, or if you're developing some software, let's say you're developing a CI/CD pipeline or a Jira ticketing system, security will be required, right? For Ping Identity makes cybersecurity solutions. That's true. But cybersecurity in itself is a very error prone thing. If you want to make an IAM system, there are lots of different functionalities and use cases that you want to hit. For example, Ping Identity has standard authentication like username and password, and it has all the other types of authentication schemes as well. Like it supports OIDC, SAML, Kerberos, amongst many other things. I'm just talking about all the authentication that happens. But then once the authentication happens, the customer journey personalization or customization is a big part of Ping Identity's product suite, right? How do you design the experience that you want to give to the user who is trying to log into your system? Ping Identity provides a lot of suites for that. For example, it has Pingman MFA that performs
Mm-hmm.
multi-factor authentication. It has Ping ID that performs multi-factor authentication on an on-prem setup or an advanced services setup. Then it has the Ping One Fraud and Ping One Risk. And these products are very interesting because they study the patterns, they study the parameters that are relevant to the incoming request, the incoming login request, or the user that is trying to log in. And
Mm-hmm.
they, using the AI ML, AI based assessment models, it tries to detect whether it's a fraudulent transaction or not, or whether it's a high risk transaction or not. And depending on the risk score that is generated, you might want to selectively trigger MFA for those transactions. And for example, one of the parameters is, let's say, geo velocity, like IP geo velocity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for
Yeah.
example, if I log in from Bangalore at 10 a.m., and then all of a sudden I log in from, let's say, Amsterdam at 10:05 a.m., right? It is practically
Mm-hmm.
impossible for me to travel from Bangalore to Amsterdam in 5 minutes.
Absolutely.
So that's a big red flag. So what you do is you take the geolocations corresponding to the IP address that's coming in, and you calculate something called an IP geovelocity. So what is your geovelocity compared to the last time you logged in? And based on that, you might selectively trigger MFA because the customer doesn't want to provide an MFA screen every single time. It only wants to do that when the transaction is risky. All of those integrations and customizations in the journey are very error prone. Like that, as you can understand, there are lots of moving parts, and I just mentioned like only a few of all the offerings of Ping Identity.
Yeah.
So if you want to integrate these moving parts into one orchestration system, and then you want to design your customer journey, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of things that can go wrong from the security perspective. For example, what if I can inject a certain headers from a request that I'm sending, a login request that I'm sending, and manipulate the AI model to bypass the MFA authentication altogether? That's one of the scenarios that can happen, right?
Okay.
So that's why
Interesting.
you need cybersecurity of a cybersecurity product, as you can understand.
Yeah.
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 And
I mean,
similarly, a second example would be since we are making flows, right? And flows are things that are expected to happen one after the other serially. Can I bypass one step by doing something with the flow data? So I'm storing, let's say I have a flow data. Can I hit the third step of the flow without going to the second one? Can I do that
Okay.
directly from the first? So all those things are things that we need to take into consideration when designing a very robust IAM system. And a security engineer inside of a security engineering company or a cybersecurity company does exactly this.
Okay. Okay. Great insight. Yeah. Now that is making a lot of sense when you spoke about the components, right? I think a lot of the viewers will be able to relate to that because they would have worked on DaVinci, they would have worked on Ping ID and Ping on Risk Protect. And what you just explained is a part of the risk based authentication where they are
Yes,
doing continuous evaluation and then uh, based on the risk level, the action is being taken, right? Okay, that actually gave me also a good context around why Ping might need product security engineer or a layer of security on top of what they're doing. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Sundar, for this great insight.
absolutely.
So moving on to the other question is when you talk about security, right? I mean, what you just said is the implementation, the use cases, right? But what are some of the common security challenges that you face in your role, and how do you address them day to day? Because even like when I talk about a scenario, like if you are being given a scenario, it will not necessarily mean that you would have had a prior experience, right? Because Ping might not build a feature that is already built, right? So everything could be a new for you. Every scenario is new for you. So how do you face them, and how do you address them? These kind of scenarios.
So, for the challenges part, I think the biggest challenge in an organization like Ping or bigger than Ping is that we have got a huge catalog of products. And by huge catalog of products, I mean that there are multiple repositories per product, and each repository can have multiple modules, and each module leads to some kind of a binary that together makes the product work. The sheer volume of vulnerabilities that arise from those, and sometimes a lot of them can be false positives or false signals. But how do you hunt for the right vulnerabilities, the one that those are meaningful from a jungle of vulnerabilities that just arise every single day is the biggest challenge in my opinion. So let me give an example.
Yeah.
So for example, Ping Federate contains millions of lines of code. Okay. And when we scan for vulnerabilities, and by scan, I'm talking about SAST, I'm talking about the SCA, the software composition analysis, and all of that. How do you correlate all the dependencies that we pull in, right? How do you get a list of a bill of materials, essentially? How do you get a list of all the CVEs that are present
Mhm.
in a particular module inside of a product? And since the product is that huge in itself, and there are so many different products, like for example, DaVinci is a very complicated product. There's so many dependencies, so many moving parts, so many integrations. And when we talk about integrations, I'm talking about the connectors, the DaVinci connectors, and the DaVinci connectors are in hundreds, right? With all those hundreds of different connectors, with all the scans that are running, we receive tens of thousands of CVEs reported every single day, right? Not a
Mhm.
lot of them are
Mhm.
actually meaningful. Sometimes it can be like the same library got used in different modules. None of them are really affecting the product itself. So what do we do? Do we go and upgrade all 10,000 of those libraries, or on all do we go and address all 10,000 of those vulnerabilities? No, of course not. It's going to only address things that are meaningful. And by meaningful, high severity, or even if it is a medium severity, or and reachable. That vulnerability must be reachable in the product. So reachability analysis. So how do we do this? I think that's a big part of a challenge that we are trying to solve inside of Ping right now. And we've taken very good steps in order to do that. The first step to solving this would be the SIAM monitoring, right? Security incident and events monitoring. The SIAM platforms are essentially where you submit all your data after correlation,
Uh-huh.
and you get a unified view in a dashboard, like what you're doing, what are all the
Yeah.
vulnerabilities that you have, right?
And one thing just to add there is Splunk is an example of that.
So there are
Okay.
many. There's Splunk, there's New Relic, there's Sumo Logic, there's Elasticsearch Stack, right?
Uh-huh.
ELK Stack. So there are many of them.
Okay.
Yeah, internally we have traditionally been using Sumo Logic, and I find that tool very good. But yeah, Splunk is another one. We can use Splunk. It's very good as well.
Mhm.
But yeah, the point is we need some kind of an internal tool that pulls the data out, the findings out, and the reports out periodically from all these tools that we are running, correlates them, deduplicates the research, the vulnerabilities that we research on, and then essentially give us a highly deduplicated, meaningful view in a dashboard in some SIAM platform, right?
Okay.
So there is an internal orchestration monitoring kind of a platform that we have developed. It's called Astra. I'm not going into too much of details because it's an internal tool, but
Yeah,
that's
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, but that's where the development experiences would be required because it's a very sophisticated development piece that we've developed, right? It's a software that essentially pulls the data out, correlates, reduces into something that is meaningful, filters out data, and then gives us a very unified dashboard view in Sumo Logic.
I hope you enjoyed the first part. Yes, there is an interesting conversation coming up in part two. Please feel free to comment down below, reach out to Sundar's LinkedIn handle, connect with him. If you're really excited to know more about his journey, feel free to talk to him. Feel free to take advice, guidance from him, and see you in the part two of the episode. Thank you.